So today we're going to start talking about our final project for the class, which is the tote bag. Here I have an example that I have previously made. Sorry it's not ironed, but mine is all in muslin. I have been using it in my studio to really kind of like store and transport supplies. But I will show you a little bit about it. So it's a pretty straightforward tote. I've made mine pretty tall. There is a complete lining, so when we look inside, there are no raw edges. All the seams are finished, which is a really beautiful way of learning how to do a lining. There's also a facing, and so this gives you opportunity to play with different fabrics. The shell or the outer of the bag can all be the same. You can use muslin for this project, but you also do have the opportunity to use a contrast fabric for the facing. You can also do some decorative stitching. Mine is in a dark thread just for demo purposes so that you can see. And then we have two straps, one on each side. This all can be modified, okay? So you can have a different color lining, different color facing. It is totally reversible. So if I pull it right side out, you have the opportunity to have that facing on the outer, and then the finished corners of the bag are exactly the same as they are on the outside as they are on the inside. So there's a lot of opportunity to play with different fabrics and prints in this bag, but it is a fully finished, self-finished, that's our stitching right at the top, tote bag, completely functional. Again, I have created mine in muslin for demo purposes, and I probably will for our example as well. I haven't quite decided yet, but I think it's easier to see what's going on. Muslin is a really sturdy fabric, so this is held up just fine. If you do opt to use muslin instead of like a cotton woven or a denim or a canvas or twill, any of those, you will need to block your muslin, right? If you use a other fabric, like a fashion fabric, you do not need to block it. It might be helpful to wash it first and allow it to shrink, but you do not need to block it as you would muslin. I'm going to go ahead and get started with drafting our pattern. I'm just working on some brown paper. I already have it laid out. This is like brown craft paper. If you are making your own pattern, I think using something stiffer like a poster board would be great, because it's going to give you some stability as you're tracing out the pattern pieces. So I do have several pieces that we will be creating. The first is the shell, which is this outer. And then we have the lining, which attaches to the facing here. And then we have straps. So we'll make one strap pattern, one facing pattern, one lining pattern, and one shell, but we'll cut two of each. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about labeling our pattern. So the first thing I am going to do is go ahead and establish my grain line, which will also be my center. I'm using pen just for the sake of this demo so that you can more easily see what I am up to. So I have my center grain line. What I can do is extend it just a little bit. When I am doing this, I'm holding my clear graph ruler really, really steady with my left hand and tracing with my right, or drawing with my right, just so that it doesn't move or shift. From there, I'm going to go ahead and square up my line. If you're working with an L square, that is totally fine. But I want to make sure that if you are using your clear graph ruler, just go ahead and square that line. I'm not paying attention to measurements right now. I will in just a second though. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead, extend this a little bit in each direction. I do have some pattern weights on my table, and those are just kind of like keeping my paper still. If you do not have pattern weights, like a can of soup will work most excellently. Okay, so I am going to determine how tall I want my bag. This will not be the finished size. we do have to take into account, we're gonna lose some of our height when we pattern the bag for sewing up our corner like this. So when I do that, I'm prepared to lose about 1.5 inches on each side. So whatever my height is, I'm essentially gonna subtract 1.5 inches to create that like bottom base of the bag. My cat always makes an appearance. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and say my bag will be 14 inches tall. So I'm going to square it right at 14 and create a perpendicular mark at 14 inches. From here, I'm gonna go ahead and square another line. And I just bumped it, so I'm gonna fix that. Okay, so I measured 14 up. I kind of like the idea of having a wider bag. That's kind of the way I travel. So we'll do 14 inches in height. Okay, 14 inches in height. And I'm gonna go ahead and do 18 across. So I'm gonna put it right on 9 inches each way. This is an 18-inch ruler, 2 inches by 18 inches. So now I can go ahead and square my sides. Okay. Let's extend this line a little bit more. I normally absolutely never pattern in pen. I erase a lot. I have a tendency to never leave enough space for myself. So the clear graph ruler is really coming in handy. Okay, so this essentially is going to be the shell of my bag. I made it 14 inches. I'm losing 1.5 inches, so my bag will be 12.5 inches in height. Okay. So what I'm going to do now, because we're making a production pattern, which means we're going to trace this pattern over and over again, but not add seam allowance, we're going to add seam allowance directly to the pattern so that we don't have to continuously trace our seam allowance onto our fabric. That would take up a bunch of time. It's actually a lot faster just to add it onto the pattern. So if you've ever worked with commercial grade patterns, they already have that seam allowance built in. So if you've ever purchased like a McCall's or maybe a Grain Line Studio, etc. So our our seam allowance for this project is going to be 1/2 inch for everything. That makes it nice and easy, really consistent. I'm going to go ahead and just start adding 1/2 inch border to all of our sides. Again, this is our grain line, so this is the interior of our pattern. I'm going to label our pattern here, so I'll leave it blank for just a moment. Something to note is that I did not extend my side seams up any further. They're just at 14 inches. I'm going to go ahead and extend them through the seam allowance at the top and the bottom. Okay. I'm doing that for all sides. I'm also going to go ahead and do it for our grain line. When we are lining up the grain line onto the pattern, it does make it a lot easier to see the fibers and align them. So whenever you have a grain line and it's just kind of drawn in the middle of the pattern, I extend that line all the way through so that I can see what it's doing on my fabric. I did mention at the beginning of this class that pattern makers really prefer to work with mechanical pencils because they do not dull during this process of tracing seam allowance and patterns, etc., etc. So you really always want like sharp lead to work with. A pen obviously will not go dull, but I hate having mistakes on a pattern, so I'm going to try to be really perfect with this one. Okay, so right now I have my seam allowance drawn around my 14-inch tall, 18-inch wide rectangle. I am going to go ahead and create a label for my pattern. The first thing I'm going to do is give us some arrows for our grain line so we know that that's what it is. Okay, so just little arrows up and down. Whenever we label a pattern, we always label it directionally towards the top. Okay, so if this is a pair of pants and the waist is here, my label always goes up. If this is a shirt and my collar is here, my hem is here, the label still goes up. So it always goes directionally towards the top. That's how we know up from down on a pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and call this Tote Bag Project. Okay, and then I am going to label my pattern piece. This is our shell. So the shell or the outer, those are kind of interchangeable terms. So Tote Bag Project shell, I'm going to say cut to. I'm going to circle that because I know that I need like a front and back to my tote bag, right? I need two sides. Okay, so Tote Bag Project shell cut to. I always give it my name so people know that this is my pattern. And then most importantly, I find it is dating the pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and add 2/24/24. Dating the pattern is essential, especially when you are working with garment and you're working with different iterations of garment. A lot of time you'll have like 3 different versions of the same bodice and the tweaks are so minor you cannot tell which one is updated. The date is essential. It'll tell you which one is the newest. It'll give you context of which one, maybe fit great, but we made changes to. It will also be a record. It's really important to come up with a system. I have a habit of labeling things new, newer, newest, super newest, right? With these kind of like superlative terms. That helps me, but dating is critical, especially if you're creating multiple versions rapidly or like in the same time frame, in the same day even. It's super, super helpful. Okay, so our shell is done, okay? I'm going to go ahead and trim some of this paper away so I can slide it out of my way. So, okay. So my next step is I'm actually going to slide this paper down. My shell is taken care of. I'm so excited. All right. I am going to continue working. Trying to realign my camera a little bit. I'm going to continue working. I'm going to anchor my pattern, my paper pattern down, and continue working with this straight grain line. So I'm just going to continue it up. This is how we nest some patterns onto paper, and it works beautifully when we are working with squares, rectangles, anything that will fit into itself. Okay, so my grain line is achieved. So when I referred back to my tote bag, we just created the shell pattern. This is the outer. It's the biggest pattern piece that we're going to be working with, and we need 2 of them. That's why we wrote cut to and circled it. For the next part, I'm going to work on my lining, okay? And so I'm going to create a 3-inch facing, which is going to subtract from our overall pattern. our lining and our facing need to add up to the shell. So I know that my shell is 14 inches tall by 18 inches wide. My lining will still be 18 inches wide, so I'm going to continue these side seams up as well, right? That's already like a pretty clear guide. But I'm going to subtract 3 inches from 14, okay? So my lining is going to be 11 inches tall. So I'm going to find 11 inches on my ruler. And the first thing I'm actually preemptively going to do, I'm going to go ahead and give myself another ½ inch of seam allowance. I'm going to build it in there already. So let's go ahead and just add a ½ inch. When we start to get to dividing these patterns, this is my stitch line here, this is my stitch line, this is my cut line. When I get to dividing the patterns, I can cut once on my pattern piece and make a beautiful pattern, as long as I cut very cleanly. If you are not taking your time and not cutting cleanly, you'll make a bit of a mess. It will not be worth it. So it's a great trick as long as you do it correctly. Okay, so again, my stitch line is here, my stitch line is here, this is my cut line, this is how I'll isolate those two patterns. So I built in a ½ inch on each side. I'm going to measure 11 inches up from my stitch line. Okay. So 11 inches, mark my perpendicular mark, okay. And then again, it's going to be 18 inches wide. So right at 9 inches, I'm going to mark my side seam. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Okay. I'm going to repeat the process. So I'm going to establish my top of my pattern here. And then I'm going to connect my side seams. Let's see. Okay, so right there. And right here. Okay. So my lining is there. I already added that ½ inch at the bottom, and now I'm going to continue adding my ½ inch seam allowance all the way around. I'm going to, just like I did previously, extend my stitch line into that seam allowance, right? It's just going to help me when it comes time to sewing. Okay, that looks great. Everything looks good here. So I'm going to go ahead and add my ½ inch. So as you build, if you're nesting your patterns the way I am, if your paper's big enough, it'll help you just start connecting those lines, right? Because our patterns all have this, they have different heights, but they have the same width of 18 inches, if you're following my measurements. If you are adjusting yours any, nothing wrong with that at all. But you can kind of follow along the same guide as long as they're squares and rectangles. Okay, and then my ½ inch seam allowance at the top. Okay, so my lining is complete. That's awesome. It looks really good. I'm going to go ahead and label this directionally up at the top as well. Okay, the cat is back. So I'm going to give it essentially the same order as I did the last pattern. So I'm going to start off with my pattern title. So that is Tote Bag Project. And then this pattern piece is my lining. So last time we wrote shell, this is our lining. I'm going to label this cut 2 the same way again. I need one on each side, and then my name. And then I'm going to date my pattern as well. Okay. All right, so we're almost there. We're still going. We have one more piece. So our original shell was 14 inches tall, 18 inches wide. Our lining, we subtracted 3 inches for that facing, so it's 11 inches by 18 inches, which means our facing is our final piece, and it is going to be 3 inches by 18 inches. Okay, so I'm going to repeat my process of adding a 1/2 inch for seam allowance right away. Okay, so 1/2 inch. I feel like this pen is starting to die, which is not in my demo plans. Okay, all right, so my 1/2 inch is established. Now I'm going to measure up 3 inches. And square that from my grain line. Okay, and then from that point, line it up with 9 inches on that grain line. And then I can mark my side seam here, my side seam here. Okay, I'm going to establish that top seam. And then connect my side seams. I keep going a little short on that side for whatever reason. Okay, so I'm connected all the way. I'm going up and beyond through that seam allowance. And then I can add my 1/2 inch of seam allowance while I'm over here. Okay. I will go ahead and add my side seam here. And then I can go ahead and add my 1/2 inch of seam allowance to the top. Okay. Oh no, I did not go far enough. Okay. I'm going to extend that stitch line. Okay. All right, everything is connected. It looks great. I'm going to go ahead and label this pattern piece as well. So tote bag project. Give myself some arrows. These are kind of crazy looking. Tote bag project. And then label it facing. Cut to again. My name. Your name. And then the date. Okay, beautiful. So the only thing I have not done yet is cut out my strap. What I am going to do is flip my fabric, or my paper, excuse me, to the side. I am going to go ahead and measure the strap that I have previously on my tote bag. I think it worked for me pretty well. So I'm just going to kind of walk my strap this way. Okay, so that's 18 right here. And then that looks like it's about 4 more. Okay, let's say 4 more will go even. So 22 inches, and I have a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on each side. So I can go ahead and just pattern in that seam allowance. So I know there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side. I like patterning like this because it really ensures that I don't have a lot of scrap. Fashion is a very wasteful industry, so I like to produce as little waste as possible. So this strap is going to be way too long. That's okay. I don't have to use all of it. So what I'll do is from the bottom, from this stitch line, this is 18. So I'll mark that, and then I'll add 4 more. Okay, so 18, 4 more. And then, ooh, I did not catch the width. My width of it is 2 inches even. Okay, that's perfect. So I can just start squaring my lines. I can just use the width of the ruler. That's awesome, easy, amazing, beautiful. The thing about the straps as you're creating them, a wider strap is going to be more comfortable. It's just going to sit better on the body. A more narrow strap will cut into your shoulder a little bit if it is shoulder strap long. Of course, you could have it messenger style. It really depends on you and what you plan to use it for. I've seen people turn these totes into lunch bags, into gifts for carrying wine, so the possibilities are pretty endless. I'm going to extend that through my seam allowance and then add my 1/2 inch. Okay, and then start creating my seam allowance at the top. The one thing I haven't done is establish where my grain line is for this strap. That's totally fine because the strap can be cut on the lengthwise or the cross grain, right? All of this tote bag really can be, since it is a square and it's not going on the body. It depends on how you want to line it up. If it works better for your pattern to line it up on the cross grain, go for it. If you save more fabric working on the lengthwise grain, also perfectly applicable. Okay, so I'm going to measure 11 inches from my stitch line. I'm going to go ahead and just like be consistent the way I was establishing my grain lines. Okay, so there's my little grain line, and then I'll label this as well, Tote Bag Project. I cannot spell or write today. Tote Bag Project. Okay, the issue with the strap is that we're going to label it strap. This time it is cut 4. So we have 2 straps, but they're all double-sided. So I'm going to cut 4 and then my name and then the date. So looking at our tote bag again, I have a strap on each side, but they have a seam on each side of the strap. So they're double-sided, they're really durable. If we want to add some decorative stitching here, like a little X or a box, we definitely can. But we'll need to cut 4. So it's 2 of the shell, 2 of the lining, 2 of the facing, 4 of the strap. Okay, so again, however they fit best into your kind of pattern Tetris of cutting it out on your fabric, the better. So I can go ahead and start to cut my pattern apart. And what I want to be mindful of is not cutting on the stitch line, right? We're always cutting on the cut line, right? So the line in between the seam allowances. Make sure all your pattern pieces have a 1/2 inch border of seam allowance, and you'll know you cut it correctly, okay? We'll follow up with starting to trace on the fabric.